Okay, thank you very much, Jessica. It's a great honor to be here and to be the moderator of this panel. This panel is on the European Neighbourhood, which is an intriguing title. And last night, I was talking to Ambassador Sparwasser, who is very witty and very wise, and she said I should open it up by saying, why are we here, these three? You saw the ambassadors panel this morning, and the stage was so crowded. One answer, obviously, is there was no room. But the other answer is, of course, they are not Arctic Council members. They're not Arctic states in that sense. But in another sense, the UK and Germany have played such a prominent role in the Arctic over time, an extraordinarily prominent role. A couple of decades ago, I toured the Canadian North looking at science projects, and I was astonished to find, and disappointed to find, there were in fact more German and UK researchers than Canadians, science, and obviously EU. And both are countries that have had a large relationship with the Arctic in the past, and that is why they are here, but they're also here because they have a very large role, Arctic strategies, for the present. And they are significant players in so many respects. And what I wanted to do is to have our speakers today, and I'll start immediately to my left with Ambassador Sparwasser from Germany, and next to her, Melita Grabic, who's the ambassador for the European Union, and the Deputy UK High Commissioner, Dave Prodger, speak. And each one of them will speak for about 5 minutes, just outlining where their countries or the EU stand on the Arctic today in terms of the issues we've been talking about today. And there have been so many issues. If they could do it in 5 minutes, I'll be astonished. But I will hold them to 5 minutes. With that warning, I'll let you start, Sabina.
Thank you so much, Don. It's really a pleasure, and I did really ask myself why, especially after having listened to my colleagues, my Arctic neighbor colleagues, and to all the experts this morning. Indeed, what can we bring to the table that these excellent experts haven't already said and brought to you? It's a fantastic conference, I want to say, to begin with. I've taken copious notes and learned lots. So why are we here? You heard all about the Arctic and its geopolitical, its ecological, its economic importance. You heard foremost also a lot about the extraordinary people of the North. And Germany is a globally interested, globally engaged nation. Germany is a world trading nation. Germany is a nation that is very committed to research. So that explains it. But let me go a little bit back, and John already mentioned it a bit. Germany has a deep and very old fascination with the North. Our first German expedition to the North Pole was in 1865, and after that, it was a continuing research effort. The Moravians, the monks, the missionaries, came to the Labrador Arctic in the 1860s, and the first ever Inuktitut dictionary was one written over the years. It's a big book by a German monk who lived in northern Labrador and who wrote down all the words sort of phonetically as he heard them. But one of the astonishing things was you had very often very long German explanations for very short Inuktitut words. And the Inuktitut word described something you do in the winter, like put your kids on the sleigh or put the dogs in front of it. And for the German version, you would need 2 sentences at least. Anyway, beginning with that kind of commitment, Germany has developed this fascination, but also what John already pointed to, an extraordinary scientific focus. I don't think there are many nations that have such a deep commitment to researching the northern, the Arctic and the Antarctic. We have founded an institute in the 1980s by a decision of the German parliament, because it is in the national interest. It's called the Alfred Wegener Institute. It's a very big institute that now employs more than 1,000 people, and their annual budget is 150 million. So for a research institute of a non-Arctic nation, this is quite significant. Perhaps also to illustrate it, the Alfred Wegener Institute did what was the biggest expedition to the north in 2020, and it was putting our research vessel, an icebreaker research vessel, into the Arctic and let it be frozen in for a year. And they had researchers from, I think, up to 50 nations come and fly in, and they took copious data. I think they're still working on that, on exploiting those data. But it was a German-driven mission because of the interest we have in the research. Maybe another story to tell to illustrate how interested we are. Last year in April, we had a state visit of our federal president, Dr. Frank-Walter Steinmeier. And it was, I think, the first state visit that was led by the Governor General, the first Inuit Governor General of Canada, up to the north. We went to Yellowknife, and from Yellowknife, in Yellowknife, the president informed himself about the geostrategic considerations. He saw, for example, he met the rangers. He saw how the rangers there are the eyes and ears in the Arctic, how they collect information, and how important their contribution is. And then we flew on to Tuktoyaktuk. And in Tuktoyaktuk, obviously one of the big interests was environment. Climate change is no better place to see the effects of climate change than in Tuk, where literally houses are dropping into the sea. But the other point, which was very important to my president, was to look at the resilience of societies where everybody depends on everybody else, where consensus is a driving force, and where not your own interest dominates, but where you have to move together if you want to survive. And he really highlighted that, and he saw that also in a time where our very individualized societies are falling apart. He saw that as an example and as a story that needed telling, and I can say the journalists in the delegation did write about it a lot. With all of that interest, it's clear we do have an Arctic strategy in Germany a long time ago. Actually, I think before Canada did its Arctic strategy, and I want to contradict Jim Basily, who said Canada doesn't have one. Canada has an Arctic and Northern policy framework, so there is something. Anyway, our Arctic strategy basically says, in its major themes, we want to see the Arctic as much as possible as a conflict-free zone, a zone where international law reigns. We want to be helpful in preserving the cultural heritage, which is a cultural heritage of the world of the North and its ecosystem. We want to help expand free and responsible research and engage in that. And we want to help and contribute to lifting the extraordinary economic potential of the Arctic in a sustainable manner. So we did become, in 1998, we did become Arctic observers. We're very active. The next regional conference of the Arctic Circle will be the Berlin Forum this May, and it's called the Arctic at the Crossroads. So as a policy, we are supportive of all multilateral action on all levels. We support the EU, the extraordinary EU engagement in the Arctic. We also, in light of the attack of Russia on Ukraine and the totally changed security environment, we also support that NATO has been much more visible and engaged, that the NATO Secretary General came into the Arctic. So we do need to update our strategies. We know now, or we have learned, that Arctic exceptionalism is gone. And I do want to echo what, I forget his name now, the producer of the Icebreakers said earlier on. We do think that we need, as like-minded, group together in order to offer credible deterrence, in particular in this geostrategic region that is so very important. I will leave it there. I hope I didn't overdo the 5 minutes.
You did not, and that was a fascinating presentation. Thanks, Savita. Melita?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. I have to say that I did not ask myself why I was invited. I was just very happy that I was invited. This is the first time around that the European Union, as such, is invited to this conference. And I would really agree with everything that the German ambassador said in terms of our approach, in terms of the emphasis we put in our strategies in terms of support for sustainable development, inclusive development, climate change action, and also international cooperation in the Arctic. I would also align myself with what my other EU colleagues said this morning, who are actually members of the Arctic Council. So if I try to kind of summarize what the European Union is doing and why we are, why we put together actually this strategic or policy, it's actually called EU Arctic policy. The reason is that, of course, while we have 3 member states who are members, then we have member states who are observers. We are a candidate for observing status. I don't think that any developments we will see in that regard anytime soon, but I'm just for the record, we are very much supportive of the work of the Arctic Council, and we also support working groups, the work of the working groups. Now, the gist of our policy is really we are putting front and center the people who live in the Arctic. That's number one, and that includes our support for responsible, sustainable, economic, and inclusive development, and as I said, international cooperation. Now, as the Arctic is becoming an arena of geopolitical competition for obvious reasons, we are very much promoting multilateral cooperation, the principles that underlie also that are part of our policy, or that our policy relies upon, are the principles of UNCLOS, of SDGs, of UNDRIP also. I think it's very important to emphasize this. Now, of course, our biggest role really is in research and innovation. We have very many programs that are dedicated to polar research, and that has been the case for many years now. Through Horizon 2020, we supported different venues of different avenues of polar research, including, of course, energy, climate, health. But what I want to really emphasize in this circle is that our new Research and Innovation Fund, it's called Horizon Europe. It's the biggest international innovation or research and innovation fund in the world, with 95.5 billion euros of funds available through this fund. We have special sub-programs dedicated to the Arctic research. And the very good news is that in November of this year, our leaders, that is the two presidents, President von der Leyen, President Charles Michel, who were here for the summit, met with the Prime Minister Trudeau in St. John's. They announced that Canada is associated member to this large research program. This means that Canadian researchers, institutions, also businesses, can access these funds directly. They are at the same level or have the same treatment, the same access to these funds as their European counterparts. So there is a huge potential there for development of our cooperation in the research, and also including the polar research. And when I was actually privileged enough to be part of this northern tour that the Global Affairs Canada organizes every year for ambassadors. So we traveled from in the north, from the west to the east, all three territories. We also visited, for example, Cambridge Bay and the Charles Research Center there. And we discussed the enormous potential for furthering this cooperation. Of course, Charles is a state-of-the-art facility. We also have some, and we are very much interested in collaborating in all these areas that I mentioned. Certainly also one area that we've been very much focusing on, nexus between ocean and climate change. But just to give you a sense of our investment, so this program includes, this is not exclusively for focused on polar areas, but globally, but includes polar research. We dedicated 1 billion for that, to research that nexus. And the last thing I would say, well, it's really, we see as part of this policy, we identify as the largest, the biggest, or the most complex threat in the Arctic to be climate change. And that is the reason. I mean, of course, we're not the only ones, right? But it is important to keep this in mind and really do what we can in terms of research, but also in terms of adaptation, in terms of support for the local communities to adapt, to mitigate, and of course, when we support the economic development of these areas, to keep in mind the interest of the indigenous populations, local communities, to make sure that while we are aiming to reach or to undergo green and digital transitions, we need a lot of critical raw materials to make sure that, of course, the Arctic is very rich with natural resources, to make sure that all the highest standards, ESG standards, are respected. And when I say ESG on the social, I also mean that UNDRIP principles are fully respected. So just one more thing. Well, actually, when we were in the north and we met with indigenous leaders, one sentence that really stuck with me was when this chief said that, you know, up there, they call the entire world the South. And he said, and we mean no offense by it. So those of you who are in international relations will understand, right, the global South. Some understand this syntagma to be a little bit, well, questionable. So it was really a reference to that, but it's also, you know, it's very interesting also to take the map that has the vantage point, the Arctic, and then look to the rest of the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. In response to your opening comments, you have made it clear you should be here, so you'll be invited again. Dave.
Thank you, John. Just before I start, just kudos to whoever put the slide up. We're here representing the European neighbourhood underneath a rainbow. What could go wrong? So as a Brit, we've got obviously a long history and interest in the region, going back hundreds of years, and as someone who used to be a hydrographic surveyor, I'm not going to take it personally that we spent 150 years looking for the Terra and Erebus and didn't find them. But that was really down not just to Jim and ARF, but also to the help of the Inuit customary knowledge, which eventually led to their discovery. But the discovery of those ships is really a symptom, I think, of UK and wider interest in the Arctic, and how over hundreds of years we've been gathering data, making history, understanding and learning from the Arctic. So it's not now just a site of huge scientific interest, but it's a means of tracking the ecosystem, tracking the changes, tracking the impact of our activity in that region. The Arctic is of existential importance to all of us, and particularly I think to the UK. It affects our weather, it affects our biodiversity, our health. 70% of our fish stocks come from the Arctic, and of course our security, which we talked about a lot before lunch, but we can unpack a bit more later. And this is why the UK has been a committed observer to the Arctic Council since its inception in 1996. And we're clear that the Council is the preeminent intergovernmental forum for cooperation in the Arctic. And that's the reason we welcome the resumption of the working groups, and we're putting real money into it because it has a fundamental role to play. As part of our commitment to the Arctic, last year we set out our third strategy, which was entitled Looking North, and that covers, again, the Arctic. It builds on the 2019 strategy, but actually it's a bit broader than that, because we've gone through a process where initially when we looked at government spending and we looked at security and economy, we tend to look at it through the security and defence prism. So we had security and defence reviews. Since then, we've had an integrated review, which includes economics, it includes science, it includes development, and it includes the environment. So this is no longer just about security and defence in the hard terms. This is about security in its most holistic sense, and the Arctic is absolutely integral to that. And that is why our Arctic strategy not only talks about the Arctic, but also talks about the related issues, including an annex which is about hard security. Our objective for the strategy is not only to be the best possible neighbour for Arctic countries in support of a peaceful, stable and well-governed region. It's really about 4 commitments that were set out, which are partnering and collaborating to better understand the Arctic through world-class science. It's about protecting the climate, the people and the environment, about preserving security and stability, and about promoting our shared prosperity. So I'd really characterize that by science, security, and sustainability. So we need to understand how the Arctic functions, how it interacts with the regions around it, and more importantly, what we can be doing to mitigate the changes that are being forced upon it. So, as you've probably heard from my colleagues, we have a long history in polar science. UK researchers have benefited from about £56 million, getting on for 100 million Canadian, in Arctic science funding since 2012, in addition to investments in infrastructure and wider polar investments, including the research vessel Sir David Attenborough, which will undertake its first Arctic cruise this year, which is fantastic. But in 2022, our polar expenditure was going to be around about 670 million in total. Last week, we made a further 850,000 Canadian available for UK scientists to support the work of the Council, and UK scientists remain the first for impact in terms of Arctic science papers in the world. This is really important to us from a very, very fundamental level. On security, we've talked about it a lot. You would expect me, as a UK representative, to talk about security. Our ambition is, like all of us in this room, I think, for the Arctic to be an area of high cooperation and low tension, but we know that's not a given. We've already discussed why that's the case, why what we've seen in Ukraine and a much more assertive and aggressive Russia is changing the calculus, why they are reinvesting in Cold War architecture, why they are reinvesting in Arctic-capable war-fighting machinery, why they're cooperating, as we heard from this morning about the Strider Technologies report, which said that Chinese investment in Russian Arctic interest was increasing by 87% over last year, why that cooperation with China is an important challenge for us. It's not just about the economics about it, this is about physical security, and Xi's proclaimed ambition to be a polar great power. So this is something that we're taking very seriously. It means we have to be open and honest, not just about the opportunities to be grasped, of which there are many. For us in the UK, it's obviously, we talked about resources, critical minerals, we've talked about transport and shipping. In the UK, obviously, we are interested in how this is financed and the innovative models we can look at in terms of environmental financing as well. But it also means the threats that are posed to us by this. So the opening up of those sea routes are going to play in geopolitical ways that we haven't seen yet and we haven't prepared for. So the region's security is important for all of our security. And we published our defense contribution in 2022. This was a defense contribution in the high north, and that sets out how we will defend our Arctic allies should the need arise, how we'll contest malign and destabilizing behaviors in the region that threaten our interests and that threaten the stability of the region. And it's interesting now that not only does this involve us working much more closely with our Arctic allies, but it's a collective responsibility that's being strengthened by the accession of Finland and soon to be Sweden. And it's also interesting that now Russia is the only Arctic country that's not in NATO. And as we go into the 75th anniversary of NATO, this is something I think it's going to be occupying our minds more and more. From a UK perspective, we've intensified this work as we lead the Joint Expeditionary Force. We participate in the Northern Group and the Arctic Security Forces Roundtable, which we hosted virtually last year for the first time. So this brings me on to my final thing, which is around sustainability. None of what we're doing in this region is of real value unless it makes a long-term difference. We can't protect fragile environments unless we have the science to understand them. We can't mitigate environmental impacts and geopolitical impacts unless we have a security context which permits that and permits long-term action. And we can't grow prosperity for the region's 4 million inhabitants unless there's a stability which will facilitate long-term investment and commitment to developing the region and its resources in a way that both benefits the people and the environment. So let me just finish with a couple of very quick examples of how Canada and the UK are trying to do this through our flagship CINUC project. So that's the Canada Inuit Nunavut United Kingdom Arctic Research Programme. Don't ask me to say that again unless it's written down in front of me. But it's a 3-year programme. It's worth about just over £11 million, about 18, 19 million Canadian dollars, jointly funded by Canadian federal and provincial governments, British government bodies, and the Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami. And that looks at the impact of climate change on the region as a whole and on customary lifestyles. The research topics include things like sociological resilience, food security, Inuit health. There are 13 projects running under it. Each of those projects will bring together Western science with traditional and local knowledge, with a view to actually solving some of these problems around adaptation and looking for long-term resilience for the communities who live in that area. It will look at utilizing the skills of those indigenous communities to do just that. And the last example I'll give is something that was launched just last week, which is a £5 million project, so about an $8.5 million Canadian dollar project looking at the meteorological cooperation with our UK Met Office in the lead to build an Arctic meteorological and oceanographic capabilities, products and services. And that will be launched through our international science funding with a view, again, to taking a much more holistic approach to the impact of the Arctic ecosystems on the wider ones and how we can better understand that. So thank you for inviting us. Hope that explains why I'm here and look forward to the conversation.
I think it explains it very well. And thank you for your presentations. To follow up on Dave's comments, at the beginning you said, Dave, that you spoke about the preeminence of the Arctic Council, and the remainder of your remarks were focused on security, I think. And you did talk about, and all of you did, and you made the point very, very strongly, why you should be here. The science, research, energy, history, future work in that area is extraordinary and very impressive. But coming back to the preeminence of the Arctic Council, you alluded to the fact that the Arctic Council now lacks Russia and has been through a period of great uncertainty. And the questions you referred to were mainly in the security area. 2 parts. One, where does the Arctic Council fit for you? You're an observer, you're not an observer. And the working groups of the Arctic Council are scientific. You talked about the range of your scientific support. Where do the working groups fit in terms of your scientific funding and energies? So maybe start with you and then I'll move across.
So the diplomat in me will say, well, obviously it's for the council members to decide what the council does. I mean, obviously as an observer, we're very keen to support, and the scientific programs are really important, and we are looking, well, obviously we're very engaged in a lot of the ones, for example, in search and rescue, in combating pollution, in migratory species and in ecosystems and so on. So I think there is obviously an extremely important role for us as an observer nation to be able to dovetail and support that work. On the security question, I can't give you an answer on that because I'm not on the council, but obviously the ethos of the council is one we very much support, that this is not about security. So NATO, on the other hand, and the other group are about security, and we can't have environmental security without physical security, and without physical security we can't have economic security. So they are all interlinked, without a shadow of a doubt. Obviously, if we're in a perfect world, then we would be cooperating on all of these issues across all of the observer countries and the members and the council members. And I think our aspiration, as we set out in the strategy, is that this should remain a peaceful and prosperous region, which is insulated from the wider geopolitics that are, particularly if you consider what is going on in Ukraine and the tragedy that has unfolded there and elsewhere, that does not bleed into the Arctic. However, we know that if those sea routes open up, then the time it would take to get from Asia to Europe is going to be cut by a third. You know, that is a significant economic gain, and we can't ignore that. And that will be transiting through NATO and allied waters. So we need to make sure that we are doing our homework. So I think that's where I would position it.
Thank you very much. Other comments? What are we, Melita?
Well, okay. Well, I don't have that much to say because we are not an observer of the Arctic Council. But I will say that we very much support the work of the working groups, as I said earlier, especially in the areas that fall under our policy, sustainable development, climate change, and fight against pollution and so on. But I would also say that it is important to continue with this work through working groups at the working group level, regardless of the situation that we find ourselves in due to this illegal, unprovoked war of aggression by Russia against Ukraine.
Sabina?
Well, the Arctic Council is that institution of, if you want, of Arctic exceptionalism that now has been broken by Russia. Probably was broken before the invasion, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but we were able to maintain that kind of dialogue, that kind of consensus. And I know that my Norwegian colleagues as a presidency will have a very challenging job cut out to maintain the work, because it does very, very significant work on environment, on people's security, on, you said that this morning, Trina, in the panel. The work is very practical. It's actually very important. And to build around Russia for the time being is a really difficult job, especially when you see that the Arctic Council does work, for example, on permafrost. Well, 50% of permafrost is in Russia. So whatever we do building around it will leave out half of the Arctic. So it's a real difficulty. Maybe one day, and I'm totally stepping out of my talking points here, but maybe one day we will be able, first in this environment, to speak to Russia again and to find ways of connecting on very practical questions again. Right now, unfortunately, this isn't possible, but for us as an observer to be part of this environment, and in particular to be part of the working groups that deal with climate challenges, that deal with all of these questions, is a very important part. And we're very engaged, in particular through the Alfred Wegener Institute that I mentioned earlier, in research. And one thing has happened, for example, for the Alfred Wegener Institute. It was engaged in a huge project on permafrost. And now it's building around Russia, so we're not doing it with and in Russian territory anymore because there's no way. So what they're doing now is a refocus, or have done now is a refocus. So the big study on this is going to be happening on the Mackenzie River Delta into the Beaufort Sea. So, we're finding ways to still do very significant work as we are now. And Germany is extremely happy, in particular on the research side, to contribute.
Thanks very much. I think we should open it up for questions. We have about 20 minutes left. Okay, back there.
Thank you, Pat Duxbury, Inuit Development Corporation Association. Want to talk about friendshoring, and I'm going to contextualize this in the fact that Western Europe has been a destination for mineral products from the Eastern Arctic for over 30 years, 40 years really. So I'll reference the Polaris mine, Nanisivik mine, in the high Arctic, both which were sent lead zinc concentrate to Belgium for smelting and or refining. Also Baffinland, I believe, sends its product to Europe, as does the Raglan mine to Norway, I believe. So the context is, Europe is involved in supply chains and sort of with respect to Canadian and Arctic mineral resources. And we're talking about friendshoring now in sort of the political discourse and the need to basically for allied countries to get together and work to not hermetically seal our economies, but certainly to support each other. And Canada offers obviously resources. The North particularly has a huge land base and prospective minerals all over the place. Can we expect greater interest from European nations and maybe the EU in investing in Northern Canada? Because we like to see it. I mean, it's great to talk on multilateral platforms for discussing sort of regulations and whatnot. But I think what really strengthens our relationship is economic development and direct European investments into Canada to replace those which would otherwise come from other countries who are looking to invest in our resources. So just wanted to kind of put that out there. And
Want to respond?
Whom do
You need to go in first.
Elisa, you want to go first?
Yes, thank you for this question. You're absolutely right. We want to diversify both the EU and Canada, diversify our supply chains, and that includes in the critical raw materials that are necessary for green transition. And so we are, well, just recently in November when we had the summit, as I mentioned, we discussed a lot this cooperation, and for 2 years now we have in place this critical raw materials partnership that gives a very good framework for developing our also business cooperation in this area. And we're also working with the provinces and speaking to the territories as well, and different levels of governance in these territories to see how we can promote this cooperation. Again, I would really emphasize the ESGs, the standards that because we are really like-minded, we see eye to eye on these standards, and that's also part of the reason why we are so interested in developing these supply chains with Canada. And basically, it is really diversifying, it's de-risking, and it is taking advantage of this close strategic partnership that we have with Canada, and it's really also connecting the with the downstream producers with midstream users, midstream and upstream in Europe. Yes, so we can call this friendshoring. We have in Europe, we have this as of December, the last month and a half, we have this Critical Raw Materials Act in effect that through which we are also trying to increase our own production within the European Union. The idea is 10% domestic production, 40% processing of critical raw materials, and up to 65% of critical raw materials or strategic minerals from one country. But notwithstanding, there is an exception for countries like Canada because we have FTA, we have strategic partnership where that cap does not apply. So certainly, and also we see eye to eye in terms of inclusive economic development, environmental standards, as I said, social standards, and so on. So yes, definitely, this is one of the focuses of our bilateral relations and development in the economic terms as well.
Dave or Sabina?
I would.
You go.
So it's a good question, but it's really difficult, isn't it? I mean, we heard today that the rare earths ore mine on the Great Slave Lake has sort of changed hands, and that the processing facility in Saskatoon is no longer functioning. I think, the problem is it's geographically, or a lot of these critical minerals, particularly in Canada, geographically distant. The season is not as long as it is elsewhere, and we're starting from a not very strong base. So when I talk to the majors who are interested in this, they're not going to get into that space until it's proven to be economically viable, and that means you've got to crowd in capital into the high-risk end of the exploration and production before it becomes viable. So Canada is historically really good at this. And we heard Yvonne say there's no problem with that this morning. We've just got to do it a lot faster. And we've got to do it in a way that brings communities with us so that everybody can benefit and do it quickly. Otherwise, we're not going to be in a position to break down those barriers. Now, we did a little bit of this. I mean, I share very much Lisa's view on this. And what we've done this year was because London is a centre for extractive industries financing, a lot of majors are based there, we invited a group of Indigenous leaders over to London to talk to the finance houses. So it became quite a didactic process where the communities were saying, this is what we must see if we are going to develop extractive industries in our lands. And the finance houses were saying, well, this is what we need to see if you're going to have an investable project. Mm-hmm. And it became a really interesting dialogue that really peeled away a lot of the misconceptions that we were seeing on both sides. So I think there, for example, in our case, UK, Canada have got a potentially really transformative role to play, because if you look at London as a centre for the majors, you look at Toronto, Vancouver as a centre for the independents, if you can facilitate that funding and facilitate that coming on stream faster in a way that respects those ESG standards, then you've got something you can work with. We've still, between us, to your friendshoring point, got to work out how we do this more economically or at a better economic equilibrium than buying it from those who don't really care so much about this. So that then becomes a trade policy question which we're grappling.
Well, I think you put this really well. I still would say there is a very increased interest and much more trade missions, much more direct contact like the one you just described, David, to basically help exploit in a sustainable manner, and that's the important part, the resources that the North holds, and to make it work for the populations and make people participate in the prosperity and in the benefits of it all. I mean, mining is never sustainable. Mining is always opening up the ground or doing things. There are now better ways of doing it, and this is something where we, Germany, actually talk a lot to the mining community, where we've started dialogue about the sustainable ways, the ways that also respect labor rights, etc. Canada has very high standards. Germany and the EU have laws, or not yet passed in the EU, but about to pass, hopefully, supply chain laws. And these supply chain laws oblige companies to say where they sourced their raw materials and how they sourced them. So did they respect labor standards? Did they respect environmental standards? And that is a real selling point for Canada, because Canada has, with CETA, a comprehensive economic trade agreement that addresses all of these issues already. So if we can say we're supplying, let's say from Northwest Territories or Yukon, it's in Canada, so the standards, it's going to be easier to prove that the standards are being met. So there are real advantages. Having said that, David is right. Even if we say we want safe supplies, and that is worth a lot, you still will have industry looking for the best kind of pricing and the best profits. And it's very difficult for the time being to mitigate that and to help with what would be then kind of a subsidizing process. So we're in the middle of that, but one thing is absolutely sure: things have to go faster. I think Minister Wilkinson talked about a mining project, if all goes well, 12 years. And the ambition is 6 years. I think the ambition really must be there to make it a lot faster, because we need basically the supplies and the safety of those supplies for our energy transition really now.
Thank you. Very good question and very good answers. Rob Hubert?
Great discussion. I've got John English staring at me, so I'm reminded of the importance of history here and what we can learn. First of all, just to give David a small correction, you guys are always saying at the UK, oh, it's 1996 when we became observers with the Arctic Council, but the reality is both Germany and the United Kingdom were in fact observers. And the EU tried to, but the sealing issue stopped it. The date is actually 1991, because it's really the real precursor to the Arctic Council, the Arctic Environmental Protection Strategy, which, as David has written, or as John has written a great book on, there's not that much difference between the AEPS and the Arctic Council, and you guys were there right at the beginning in that context, so it's 91, not 96. Now, getting back to history. And we think about the security context, and I'm reminded of a comment that General Van Herk, the former commander of NORAD, made, that if we're really talking about security, we need to talk about deterrence. If we're talking about deterrence, we need to convince our enemy that not only are we willing to fight, we know how to fight. Here's a question for both Germany and Great Britain. We have two countries that are the most extensive experience in fighting in the maritime Arctic. We think in terms of the context during the Second World War, for Canada, for the United States, for Norway, we don't have the experience of what Germany and Britain had. And I'll give three examples that perhaps we may want to start rethinking our hesitancy to look at our history to understand. The first one, the sailing of the German auxiliary Atlantis through the Northeast Passage totally surprises the British Navy when she shows up in the Asia-Pacific. See any similarities with the Chinese and the Russians working? We have the brilliant opportunity for the two of you to sit down and say, okay, how did the political planning work on that? How did the British Navy get so surprised? The failures of the PQ-17 convoy How did those decisions, yes, the technology is different, yes, the ships are different, but there were political decisions when Admiral Pound basically told that convoy to scatter, even though the Tirpitz hadn't really even sailed. So what does that mean in terms of telling the Russians and Chinese, okay, we know how to do it? And the last one is, of course, the sinking of the Scharnhorst. I mean, the Scharnhorst gets sunk because its destroyers can't stay up with it when, in fact, it's trying to hit a convoy. Those waves, those difficulties for small ships are still there. So can I ask this question? We give credit to traditional knowledge. We give credit to learning from our history. Why aren't we doing that now? Why isn't Germany and Britain leading and working together? And perhaps we can get the Japanese, because they, of course, invaded the two Alaskan islands. There are lessons learned here for the modern era. And would that not be an excellent form of deterrence against the Russians and Chinese?
What was that last one? Sorry.
The last one?
Japanese invaded some Alaskan islands.
Good. Sorry.
Okay, I guess Germany or the UK?
John, can you take that? It's really... No, that was incredibly informed, and I've been taking notes, learning from your question. Thank you very much, and I can't begin to address it totally. But, A, UK and Germany and Canada and all the other Arctic neighbors very soon are working together to face that threat. And we're doing it in NATO, and NATO is taking a very, very different approach these days. It was much more hands off the Arctic and basically North Atlantic Arctic. I think the strategic focus has shifted. Second point, expertise and working together. I've said that earlier. I think there is a good case to be made for countries working together to be faster, to be more efficient, in particular when it comes to procurement, stop doing all these very complicated special productions, but to actually pull together and create deeper corporations in order to be faster out of the gate with the equipment that we need, and in order to be a much more credible deterrence coalition, if you want. All of that, as we all are, within NATO.
Dave?
Good question. I mean, in addition to Sabine's point, I'd say two things. Firstly, credit to Canada here, because they're investing heavily on both surface combat vessel and AOPS. That's really important. And even better, a lot of the technology going into the former is British. But that's symptomatic of the fact that, we're doing it as well, and we're doing it with allies and friends. So we mentioned AUKUS before. I'm not going to get into that. But, I think there is now a realization that we need to do better on the platforms we use and sharing those platforms. Secondly, that's the reason we have a defense annex, if you like, to our Arctic strategy, because it explains why this is so important from a security perspective, and it explains why we're sending P-8 maritime patrol aircrafts into the area, and it also explains why, when we're seeing the biggest increase in Russian submarine activity in the North Atlantic since Soviet times, why we need to be much more alert to it. On the learning from history bit, I'll have to go back and consult my colleagues at RUSI and elsewhere about the best way to do that. But I accept your point. I mean, there is a bit of this where we've seen this before not that long ago. We thought we'd got beyond those days, and clearly since 2014, it's very evident we're not.
Thank you very much. This has been an excellent panel, excellent questions, and we do understand why you should be here. And thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you.